session you're having trouble, I want to reassure you that this session is being recorded. So if you do get disconnected, you can always go to the WebAge site and download the recording, listen to the recording online. So rest assured that you won't miss anything. This session is Introduction to Agile Architecture. I want to explain to you a little bit of what's happening in the industry around architecture and the Agile practice. And we've put together a curriculum to allow those that are in the position of leading architecture or doing software development where they're facing the merging of these two, looking at ways to make this work better. So we're going to cover in this session a little bit about what's going on and then take a look at the training that we have put together. My name is Christine Thompson. I'm an architecture lead with WebAge Solutions. And WebAge Solutions is an organization which many of you already know that offers extensive training covering a multitude of topics, not the least of which, of course, is architecture. So this is going to be part of the Architecture Agile curriculum. The talk is going to cover three key areas. The first is let's just put it out there. Why are we interested in this? So the background to Agile architecture, just to warm us up in this conversation. And then we can begin to explore what's involved in having this conversation. What is meant by Agile architecture? So we'll cover, you can see here, 4 key areas, what I'm calling the basics. And in the basics, you'll see that this is getting the definitions out there and then how these relate. And then getting into the connection is more about how in the industry we're working with agile environments and addressing architecture concerns. And this segues into shifting from just having architecture happening with agile and looking at how we can actually do architecture in an agile way, hence the title, Agile Architecture. So we'll look at the how-tos, what would be involved in shifting from a traditional architecture practice to an agile architecture practice. And then, of course, getting regrounded, we look at the reality, risks, and recommendations. So going in with an educated view to understand that this is not the answer to everything. There's a place where this would work. And how do we recognize it? And then what's the best way to do this work to be successful? So that's what we're going to look at over this next hour. So the first question that comes up, is there such a thing? And I have to tell you, like when I've been working with clients, I remember the very first time that this question came up. This was an organization that was adopting and actually using Agile as its software development methodology. And I was there as a consultant on architecture, and the question came up, are you going to teach us Agile architecture? And I was a little confused by that statement. I was thinking, well, Agile isn't architecture. Agile is a software development method. But then the more you think about it, the more you look at it, you start to realize, well, are you talking about doing architecture for Agile development, or are you talking about doing architecture in an Agile way? So our training is actually going to look at both sides of this. It's going to explore basically using traditional architecture practices, but how it fits with Agile, but then also looking at how you can change your architecture practice to leverage a lot of the Agile approaches. So Agile, just for those of you that may not be as familiar with it, is a software development methodology, and it has a focus on delivering high-quality software in a very quick fashion. Its iterative approach allows for requirements to come in at more than just the beginning of the software development, but over time, new requirements can come up and be responded to. So we have the idea of being a lot more flexible and agile. The other goal of Agile is to do that, to be responsive to new requirements, but to keep this all in check in terms of our timelines and our money. If you were to look at Agile more seriously, like we do have Agile training, you would also see that Agile is something that evolved out of like XP programming, out of the Rational Unified Process. Those are some of the predecessors. Not to say that those aren't still valid, but Agile is leveraging what already existed, taking what worked, and then addressing some of those areas that were a constant struggle for software development teams. So it is a software development methodology. All right, so that's good. We've got that going on for our software. So what does this have to do with architecture? So architecture is often missed in a lot of Agile projects. It might be something that is thought about as simply an element of the project itself, or something that gets done at the end of the project. Okay, we need to get sign off and we have to have our architecture taken care of. So there tends to be a little bit of a challenge in terms of how do we get the architecture issues appropriately addressed in our Agile software development process. There is this inclination to avoid doing architecture since Agile is meant to be quick and architecture seems to slow things down. So if we could approach architecture in a more agile way, being able to do architecture in an incremental way, ensuring that there's good structure there for the software, then we could have a better relationship and better results overall. So this is what a lot of organizations are looking at. When they talk about Agile architecture, they're really looking at, I'm going to be doing Agile and I need to address architecture. But we're also going to look at how we can take it yet to an even higher level. So let's explore then what we would need to discuss in order to have that complete picture of what Agile architecture is. So this comes in the training that we've put together. So looking at the emergence of Agile architecture, and when we talk about Agile architecture, it is that twofold. The beginning of it is really just understanding if you have Agile as a methodology for software development going on, how can we get architecture working alongside the Agile teams, working with them to get the best results? So our first bit of training would be the introduction to Agile architecture. And it would have us looking at the basics, having a clear understanding of what we mean by architecture and what we mean by Agile, what are the challenges both face, so that then we can look at how they relate, and working with our existing practices in architecture, the best way to align it to support Agile software development teams. The next bit of training, which is implementing Agile architecture, is saying, why don't you take a look at how Agile does its work and see opportunities for approaching architecture in the same fashion? So you can see in this one, we would begin by going into really a very, very new area. There's certainly evidence and organizations out there that have already built up an Agile architecture practice, but they're few and far between, and we're starting to see a greater interest in trying to get better results out of our architecture as a whole, and that one of the ways that we can do this is to move from a traditional architecture practice to what is being called an Agile architecture practice. So we'll walk through what would be involved in actually building architecture solutions with this approach, and doing so with a clear understanding of what the risks are and how you can best use this approach to ensure success with your architecture. All right, so let's take a closer look and see what would actually be covered in each of these training sessions. So the introduction to Agile architecture begins with the basics. And the basics then are first to look at, well, what do we mean by architecture? And why do we need architecture? So understanding the place for architecture in an organization is the beginning of this conversation. And a nice place to start is typically in the different architecture disciplines, how you can have enterprise architecture, and that is basically looking at a particular scope within the organization to align the business with IT to create and deliver on the vision for that business. And that vision is delivered through the combination of discrete solutions. So we have the solution architect that is responsible for doing a piece of the puzzle, if you will. The enterprise has a vision which is broken down into these different pieces, and these pieces are referred to as solutions. So maybe bringing in something like doing some service-oriented architecture in one place, microservices in another place, doing master data management, a lot of these working together to realize the full vision for the enterprise. Well, for a solution to be complete, it will involve engaging the different domains. And there are 4 core domains in architecture: business, application, data, and technology. So this would be the beginning of the basics. Let's just make sure everybody's on the same page and talk about architecture and how these different disciplines relate. But we need to focus on one of these 4 domains when we're talking about Agile architecture. Agile is dealing with software development, which is in the application domain. So we have a particular interest in those that have as their discipline application architecture, but understand that application architecture, whatever it's doing in terms of its architecture, has to fit with the solutions that the enterprise has prescribed. So we have the idea that the application architect is fulfilling the requirements of the enterprise. They're part of delivering on that enterprise. So there are going to be certain choices that the application architect makes, not necessarily because it's the best for a particular project, but because it's the best for a collection, a portfolio of projects as they're being lined up to fulfill the business vision, which is what is the responsibility of the enterprise architect. So we want to take a closer look at really what is the responsibility ideally, what should be the application architect's focus. Getting away from thinking of individual projects and thinking more across different portfolios, collection of projects, and how they relate to fulfill the bigger picture. Having that broader view of everything that's happening and everything that's coming down the road. So another way to look at this, this is just one example, but certainly out in the industry there's been effort over the last several decades to examine enterprise architecture and the discrete areas of focus. And this is one example coming from NIST. So when I look at this particular model of architecture, when I think of application architecture, understand that it's sitting in the middle of the pyramid, that we are going to be responding to the business needs to be able to provide them the tools, the functionality in an automated way, this is in the applications, to move information around to be able to get the work done. And all of this being supported by the technology, you know, the servers, the network, the different platforms that we have. So all of the different pieces of architecture have to be addressed, and understand that application architecture is simply a piece of it that helps fulfill the overall business, right? So the business is saying this is what we're doing today and this is what we want to do tomorrow. How do we get there? That's going to be achieved through architecture. So this is just another way to look at it. Certainly in organizations you can be leaning on a number of different industry resources to help you articulate your architecture practice. And in articulating it, then ensuring that those that are your architects understand the current state, the vision, the target where you want to go, so that what they're building will complement it. So this is the first part of the basics. But when we look at architecture, and this is where it gets a little more interesting for us, is that you know, you have this understanding. I know architecture. I know we're doing architecture. We have a practice, but we're struggling with it. So we're going to be looking next as part of dealing with the basics of what the current challenges and issues are with traditional architecture. To be able to talk about the challenges, it's going to begin by looking at the actual goals architecture has. So what do we expect out of architecture? What does it really address? One of the conversations around goals of architecture would be how architecture is delivering on the quality of service attributes, those non-functional requirements. It's up to the architecture, for instance, to ensure that we have everything in technology aligned to ensure, for instance, security. Or another common one would be availability or performance. So the architecture then is providing the structure for the environment to deliver on the quality of service attributes. Now, of course, once you've identified what your goals are for your architecture, there are certainly proven ways to be successful. So industry recommendations of the things that have to take place in order for you to know, well, what are the goals for our architecture? What are the deliverables that we need? How do we actually achieve that? So this is where you look at things like having an architecture framework, having your architecture practice with procedures, making sure that you have a reference architecture, which includes things like your glossary, your standards, your principles and policies. That this allows us to ensure that all the different pieces are going to have the best results in terms of relating to each other. Again, thinking that previous diagram with the pyramid, meaning the pyramid only works when all the pieces are aligned properly. So we start with that kind of discussion of what's expected out of architecture and how the industry has demonstrated where we can be successful. But then we keep struggling with architecture. A common thing that comes up is the complaint of lack of executive sponsorship. And clearly the thing is that the business, the leaders of the business, are behind anything that is proving to make money and to deliver value. So if architects and the architecture practice are feeling that the executive sponsorship is weak, then question is what could the architecture practice do to strengthen that? Actually, that lines up with another area of conversation, which is leadership as a whole. Clearly, you want leadership in the business to be able to understand the value that an architecture practice brings, but you need leadership in architecture to be able to educate and to promote, but you can't promote something that you're not building. So needing to have a clear understanding of what are deliverables and the best way to get there so that it is a natural fit to get that executive sponsorship. Another issue that we face is trying to get this business and IT aligned. One of the architecture practices that has that big question mark beside it is business architecture. Is there such a thing as business architecture? In most organizations, certainly that I've come across, and as is reported in the industry, is that most organizations don't have a practice called business architecture. They don't have roles or job titles called the business architect. However, when you look at what is meant by that term, you do see the work of business architecture happening. And it just may be expressed in a slightly different way. And it could be that it's still at an early stages, maybe hasn't matured to a level in the same way that you see the architecture disciplines being more formally expressed in IT. Regardless of the state of each of these practices, architecture does seek to have alignment, that I don't want to have certain decisions made about the technology unless I understand how it's going to deliver back to the business. The reason IT is there is to support the business. So how do we get the best expression of that? This is another challenge that we face in architecture. Certainly, in the order that these appear aren't necessarily prescribing that this is the order in which they happen. In different organizations, you'll have different issues that come up that tend to be of a bigger problem. So scheduling and costs, you might want to say, hey, that's number one for us. Regardless of how you prioritize this, this is definitely a huge challenge. One of the problems we have with traditional architecture is the big cost up front to doing it. And so if I'm going to be asking for a huge portion of a budget, yeah, you're going to have a lot of pushback from the leaders in the business because they haven't seen value for it. How long is it going to take to actually get something done that we can actually see a return on that investment? So trying to figure out how we can actually keep those costs in check, deliver value earlier. And arguably, one of the things that have happened over the last number of years in architecture practice is really going, okay, so maybe to do this architecture is going to take several years. Let's actually talk about breaking that down into stepping stones to get there. And we have this notion of dealing with transition architectures. And it's actually that practice of doing transition architectures that will lead us naturally into more seriously examining the idea of having agile architecture practices. But we'll talk about more of that in a minute. Another issue that we face is definitely the gap between the architects and the technical teams. And this last bullet is where we're seeing the biggest complaints in terms of organizations that have agile methodology happening for software practices and trying to get architectural concerns addressed in a timely fashion. There is a huge gap in a lot of organizations between the architecture practice and the various technical teams, software development being one of such teams. So this is definitely a challenge. Architects needing to find more meaningful ways to engage those that are actually going to building and using the architecture. So completing that gap in part could be addressed simply by looking at how we can get better results out of our architects in our agile projects. So that's the first part of the basics. And remember, we're talking about an introduction to agile architecture, so the next natural thing to look at would be to look at Agile itself. So making sure that everybody is speaking the same way about Agile, our training would take some time to actually look at what the Agile model is. So it's a software development approach, so the methodology for it. There is a thing called the Agile Manifesto, which is really an expression of its principles. So what is Agile doing? What is its selling point? And then when we look at doing Agile, what are the requirements? What do you need in order to actually be doing Agile? And what value is bringing to the table? So why would you do Agile? And this helps you identify where Agile makes sense. But understand that, like anything, there's always going to be things that can go wrong. So what are the pitfalls with Agile? So what are the things that we look at that tend to be challenging, that are going to perhaps put us in a position where Agile is actually not delivering on its values as proposed, but actually goes the other way, basically a failure. One of the things that we've seen and why we're actually talking about doing this training is that one of the big pitfalls with Agile is not addressing at appropriate times architectural concerns. Not engaging the architects appropriately at the right time to ensure that the decisions being made on an Agile project are going to be able to be fulfilled appropriately in its structured environment. What should that structure be? What is it? And is it something that an Agile project should be able to dictate, or is Agile more of a subscriber to an architecture? So this is one of the areas of concerns with Agile, is how we get architecture addressed. So we have an understanding of architecture and its challenges. We see what Agile is. And now when we take a closer look at Agile, you can start to see why they are resistant or why they struggle. Like, even if you know you need architecture, you're just struggling with, well, where and how is architecture going to be addressed? This is a visual of the Agile methodology. And the key thing to really notice in this is how iterative it is. So you integrate and test, and you do more development. Integrate and test and do more development. Integrate and test and do more development. And clearly, as we're going through these different development phases, other requirements can actually come in and be added to the stack, which influences then what we're developing in each of these phases until we finally have a product that is now released. You can see here released, and it could be that it's not accepted and we continue to go back through it. So you can go through a series of these iterations, but even if you're accepted the first time through, you've had several iterations gathering up different levels of requirements. So requirements management is quite unique in Agile as we compare it to more traditional software development methods. Another aspect which isn't being shown in this diagram is who's participating on the teams. So you can see here continuous visibility between clients, developers, users. The actual participants in an Agile process is more collaborative. So stakeholders are identified differently and are managed differently. And this flies in the face with how traditional architecture practices want and tend to work. They don't fit into this. So where would you do architecture? And while ideally at the very least we want to have architecture handled at the beginning, right? So where we start the project, get the requirements, set up the environment. Well, wait a minute. Didn't we just say that during these different development phases we can get different requirements? So we're saying, okay, we'll get some architecture done at the beginning, but then at each phase of development we need to have more architecture being done. And traditional architecture methods would slow this wheel turning down, and Agile methodology says, hey, we're going to be quick, we're going to keep costs in check, we're going to get the product out there in a very short period of time. And if I'm re-engaging my architecture teams, I'm just going to grind to a halt. So there is resistance, natural resistance on Agile teams about engaging architects too early or too often. So is there a way that architects could work differently to be able to not hinder but complement the Agile methodology? That's a bit of a question that we're left with when we understand exactly how architecture works compared to how Agile works. So that brings us to the next part of the conversation of what we're calling the basics, the Agile and architecture conflict. So you can see that Agile techniques do not fit with traditional architecture methods. Agile wants things to be responsive, to be quick, to be kept in line. It's a collaborative effort. Requirements are constantly being integrated. And when we look at doing architecture, it wants to have time. It's going to do planning. It's going to build the structure that's needed. It's not going to be flexible. It's making decisions that are difficult to change. And that's what we see from architecture. So the two don't seem to go together. So the question that arises here is where and how do we address architecture concerns when we're doing an Agile project? Are we really talking about two completely different things? Like maybe what we do is just simply say, okay, this is the architecture and Agile, just deal with it and don't re-engage the architecture, just work with what you've got. You can't go to the store and buy something new. You got to just take what you've got, and architecture is just not even a part of this conversation. Or is there a way that we can actually see new opportunities to improve the architecture as we work on different discrete Agile projects? So I'm thinking maybe it is apples and oranges, but both of those are fruit. And so there's a part there that they are going to relate on. So let's take a closer look at that conflict. So that moves us into the next part of that introduction to Agile architecture training. Cover the basics. Now we want to say that the two have to coexist. They both need each other. So what is the connection? So this moves us into the next part of that introduction training. So architects are really going to be the ones we're going to lean on to do the changing. Agile works the way it is. This is the methodology for software. Agile needs architecture, so architects need to be creative about how they work with Agile teams. So they have to bend their approach to work within the Agile world. So we'll look at how in many organizations, they've been successful at integrating architects as part of the Agile team so that architecture concerns can be addressed in flight appropriately, and looking at how they actually work with these self-organizing Scrum teams. So again, just as much as the requirements can change as we go through each development phase in Agile, the actual workers in a development phase, those that are part of a team, can change. So different stakeholders can come and go. So being more flexible in our approach, not being basically black boxing software, we're thinking of actually keeping it open and more agile and dynamic. So architects are then going to learn how to live within an agile world and to be positive participants on an agile team. Now, understand, as a leader in an agile project, recognizing the importance of architecture, software needs to have an environment to run in. If I create an application, I want to deploy it to a server. Well, where did that server come from? What programming languages am I working with? What tools do I have? All of those are decisions that are architectural in nature. So architecture decisions are happening. We want to make sure, though, that in making those decisions, they're complementing all the other projects that are happening. So Agile does need architecture as its backbone. In order for us to be able to be agile, to move quickly, I want that environment to accommodate me. So that's part of the expression then of architecture, is that recognition on agile teams of the importance to having sound, solid architecture. The next thing, sort of going the other reverse, architects need to understand not to over-engineer. We're not trying to go for perfection. We're trying to look at what is needed now, good enough for now. And this helps to keep costs in check and keep the practice of architecture a little bit more nimble. Right? If we're not thinking of creating perfection, but thinking of what is absolutely needed at the core and delivering that, and then moving on to the next piece and seeing architecture more as something that evolves over time rather than something that's going to be fixed. This is another way in which we want architecture to fit in with Agile. Not Agile fitting in with architecture, that won't happen, but architecture fitting in with Agile to actually support it is correcting some of the behavior that has been a challenge in architecture. So here's a visual to help you see a little bit of how this works. So when you're looking at doing our Agile modeling and communicating, working with and updating the project, working with your developers, and how you have this, basically the initial architecture vision is then going to be supporting the view of the stakeholders, the needs of the stakeholders. Notice as well that we're going to take feedback and change the architecture. We're working with developers, taking feedback and updating the architecture. And that allows for the architecture then to be creating the structure and the environment evolving over time. We're not just saying, look, you're going to have to give me time to create this end result. We're thinking, what is needed right now? I'm going to design it in a way that allows me to add to it later so that the architecture then is going to improve over time. It's not going to be perfect first time out. It's going to be good enough for now, is a little bit of a motto. And then we're going to add improvements to it. And because we're adding improvements to it, the idea is the improvements are being solicited from our key stakeholders, the developers, the clients, the users. We're soliciting feedback from them. Well, that is how Agile works. It's soliciting that input from the various stakeholders to improve the software that's being built. And architecture then is going to be built the same way. So this is architecture fitting in with Agile is going to have this approach to defining its architecture. It's not just going to go once, get the input, go away, create it, and bring it back. It's going to be more iterative, and it's soliciting the inputs from those various stakeholders and to build it over time. Have an evolutionary approach to your architecture. So then moving away from thinking of, well, where did they have conflict? zeroing in then on how they actually connect. What do they have in common? Remember thinking apples and oranges. Yeah, there's definite differences here, but they're both fruit. So let's start by focusing on the fact that they do share certain concerns. Both Agile and Architecture have a keen desire and an explicit need to align what they're doing with the business. So this is something that they can both collaborate on. They're both interested in and have a need to get good results out fast. If you recall, when we were looking at the challenges that architecture faces, that whole big label thing called executive buy-in and keeping scheduling and costs in check, if we can get good results out faster, we're meeting our timeline, we're keeping costs in check, that's going to inspire more sponsorship from the business and the powers and the entities. So we all have an interest in finding something that we can deliver on that's bringing value back to the business sooner rather than later. And Agile's definitely doing that. That's one of the big selling points of Agile, and Architecture saying, hey, however you're getting that done, I want to do that too. So they're both very interested in this. And obviously getting good results out fast help us to stay on budget, so there's always going to be a budget concern. Now planning, this is something that Agile has to think about and can be a bit of a pitfall for Agile if it's not done wrong. So a good way to fail at Agile is not to have the planning done. Architecture, we talk about thinking of the vision first, having the picture ahead, so this is top down, and that we basically start with the big picture, we decompose it into its parts that then define how to build it. So you build from the bottom up. Well, we can start to see how the natural fit between Architecture and Agile come in. There's a point in which the Agile project is doing its planning. That's a good place to really heavily engage the architect. The building itself, well, we have to build the architecture. The architecture needs to be built before the software, so we can actually maybe change the iteration of an Agile methodology where it's being preceded by the architecture work. And then another thing they have in common is trying to keep things simple. This is that whole anti-pattern for architecture is over-engineering. So keeping things simple with the idea that I can have something that works now. It may not be my ideal, but it works now. And that over time, I'm going to be given opportunities to actually improve it. So looking at having more of an evolutionary approach to architecture. So clearly we see that for architecture. Agile thinks the same way. Let's get something out there. That's the development phase one. Get some feedback on it, improve that, add to it. So we have this incremental, iterative approach to working with our stakeholders, gathering and addressing our requirements. It's not a one-off thing where it has to be overly done, over-engineered, overly complex. We want to keep things straightforward, simple, addressing that particular need with the idea that we can improve it as time goes on, using that iterative approach to it. So both Architecture and Agile by definition is doing this. Architecture by desire will seek opportunities to do this. So when we look at this, this really is looking at really the fundamentals of both Architecture and Agile, and they really are speaking the same way. How it gets expressed will be different because what they're doing is different, but you can see how they can have areas where they relate. So is there Agile architecture then? So what we just talked about was the fact that we have architecture, we have Agile. We can see that architecture can do a better job at fitting in and complementing the work of Agile, so architectural concerns can be addressed. But what we want to do now is say, well, if we start doing that, if we start getting our application architects bending to fit better with Agile teams, doing work in a particular way, could we leverage that approach for other architecture work? So as we're saying here, can architecture itself be Agile? So is there a way to take advantage of what's working for software development that we can use that for architecture practices? So to do this, we'd have to stop and think, well, what are the actual deliverables for architecture? And sort of tongue-in-cheek, and maybe some of you can relate to this, that maybe we think that only deliverables for architecture is a bunch of documents and diagrams, right? So the idea that we're modeling for modeling's sake. But in reality, that's not what the deliverable of architecture should be, right? That's simply documents are a communication tool of what they're building. So what they actually build is their deliverable. So what are the structures that the architecture is responsible for? So we want to be able to articulate that. And then taking a look at what those deliverables are, ask the question, is there a way that these can be built and delivered quickly and incrementally, meaning that maybe we can get some of it out and it works with the idea that we're going to improve it over time. So what in our architecture practice would fit with doing it that way? And then the other question that comes up is how we're engaging our stakeholders and dealing with our requirements. So are there opportunities in architecture to get greater collaboration, to move away from it may be an extreme term to say dictatorial approach, but where the architects are saying, this is my job and I'll decide and you just do what I say. I've heard it in organizations where the software development teams are referring to their architects as police. They're just coming in here and causing us trouble, and if they just go away, we could drive as fast as we wanted. So we want to get better collaboration, at the very least, between the architects and the development teams themselves, particularly when we're talking about the Agile architecture relationship. But just even thinking, if I can do that with my software teams, could I not do that with the business and with the data teams and with the technology and any other domains that we've identified? So thinking, is there a better way for us to be doing architecture, being more collaborative? And in that way, we can be more responsive. But it does have us start with that first question, do we even know what our architecture deliverables are? So this question, is there Agile architecture? Well, in reality, what we've seen out in the industry over the last several years is organizations that haven't been waiting for everybody to decide this is a good idea. They saw that this was a good idea, that we actually do need to have enterprise architecture practices that have taken a different approach to be set up with the goal of having better alignment and better agility. And that to do that means that we'll take more of an Agile approach, reinterpreting the Agile methodology from software to architecture. That this is not about just working with Agile projects. This is about how we can do architecture differently. And that in this way, we could also invite perhaps other improved methodologies and approaches for both business and other IT disciplines and activities. So one of the things that we'd like to look at then are examples in the industry of those that have been successful in shifting from a traditional architecture practice into what is being labeled the Agile architecture practice. So it is happening out there. Not widely, but definitely there's huge interest in growing. This is the direction that we're taking architecture. So we would finish our introduction to Agile architecture by getting a big picture of what would be involved in actually doing it. So understanding that in an architecture practice, we have a set of elements that we work with. The key one, of course, is the reference architecture, which would be saying, you know, here are the standards, here are the principles and policies, here are the reference models, the decision frameworks, things like that. That's the reference architecture. And the reference architecture then is used and is supporting the procedures that we have. So what would be our procedures? So clearly we would be looking at how do the procedures have to change in order for them to be Agile. with these elements in place, another part of the architecture practice is supporting the communication and education, making sure that everybody knows how to do things well, making sure that we're engaging people at the right time in the right way, so that it's one thing to sort of go away and create something, but it's another thing to get everyone to understand it and use it. And so the communication education is a critical part to architecture success. So we'd be looking at, well, what do those things look like for Agile architecture? How do you go about, if you've made a decision, I really like this idea and I want to take it further, where would you go? How would you start looking at these things in order to then move into more of an Agile architecture approach? You have to pay special attention to two key Agile elements. The way requirements are handled in Agile is quite unique. In other words, requirements are not done at the beginning of the project only. Yes, they're done at the beginning, that's a starting place, but they're done iteratively. They're constantly being added, taken away, and adjusted. This is quite unique. So we need to be thinking in our architecture, if we're going to be doing Agile architecture, how are we going to handle our requirements management? And then stakeholder management. In Agile, stakeholder management allows for the teams to be self-defining, to be changing as we go, much like how requirements are handled in a more dynamic fashion, stakeholders are handled in a more dynamic fashion. And so with our architecture, we need to make sure that stakeholder management is more inclusive, allowing the voices of various stakeholders to be heard appropriately, and that it's more efficient. We don't want to be spending a lot of time going back and forth with emails and having a lot of meetings. We want to move away from that and find a more effective way of communicating so that it allows us to be engaging everybody appropriately, but without the same time lag typically associated with it when we think of our traditional stakeholder management in architecture. So these are things that we want to take a look at. So we would finish our introduction simply by having this overview of things that you need to be re-examining in your architecture practice. So the next part of the training would be on implementing Agile architecture. And this is divided into two parts. The first part being the how-tos. So let's just do it. Let's build an Agile architecture practice. So this is the shift from the traditional architecture process. We're going to let go of what we thought was tried and true and actually thinking about approaching our architecture in a different way. Now, whenever you're making a shift, the temptation is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You definitely don't want to do that. You want to look at, well, what is in our current practice that can actually help support us moving in this direction? If you recall earlier, I was mentioning how we want to have transitional architectures where we can deliver certain parts of the architecture sooner and earlier. We're going to leverage that as a starting place for building our Agile architecture. We're going to be focusing then on how we can streamline our requirements handling and increase and foster better communication with stakeholders. We're going to be looking at what has proven to work in a way to make it more efficient. So these are some of the starting places for working with Agile. And then you have to have a vision. So again, this is a proven approach. Doesn't have to be doing architecture, but this is definitely what works well. Make sure that you have a clear idea of what it is that you want out of Agile, what are the goals, and then understand how you're currently doing things so that you can see the opportunities to change it. So you're going to actually use an Agile approach to changing from a traditional practice to an Agile architecture program, which means that we're going to build it over time. We're not just throwing out traditional and building from scratch a new one. We're making a shift gradually over time where we can break down what our desired goals are and seeing the opportunities to actually start leveraging that. Another big thing is making sure you have the appropriate people in the appropriate roles to do this. So assigning roles with the idea that you have timelines, so really pushing for a more aggressive approach to delivering results. We need to also go in with our eyes open, understanding what some of the limitations are. Remember that it's not going to fit everywhere. It's going to be able to be used in a lot of places, but knowing where it does fit is going to give you better success. So then we actually build the practice itself. So getting our reference architecture in place, and these are just some of the elements, but these are shifting what we currently have to incorporate the Agile needs. Obviously, there'll still be a lot of the artifacts that we existing have, but we're going to be changing a few of them, like working with different principles and policies to reflect a more Agile approach. And then you're going to take the traditional artifacts and then adapt them into the Agile architecture practice. Notice that it's not throw out, but simply modify them. And then identify what you can start with. So what solution is happening in your enterprise environment that would lend itself and benefit greatly from this new approach? Let's try it out on it. So have a particular pilot and gradually over time get better at it. We then move on in implementing Agile architecture into looking at the reality and risks and recommendations. So Agile architecture has its own life cycle. We saw how Agile methodology had its own way of starting. It had its iterations, the immediate states. You're going to have a way of sort of decommissioning certain things to support and bring other things in. So we want to talk about how this Agile life cycle works in architecture. Understand the different events, what would push you between one phase and another. Working with new requirements, working with new team members, working with new releases. So these are aspects of Agile, but what do those look like when we're talking about architecture? And then, of course, the procedures. What are the prerequisites for actually doing and working with this Agile architecture approach? What are the procedures for it? What is needed to get started? So the prerequisites and workflows. So having those defined. So the Agile architecture process itself. And then actually applying this. So Agile architecture solutions, where does it seem to fit really well that we are going to get good results from this? Understand this is not the answer to everything. It's going to work well where architecture evolves over time. It does support strategy good enough for now, like that I can get started. And here's a good expression of it. When you have current technologies that you are simply going to phase out over time in favor of others, then this is actually going to fit nicely with a more Agile architecture approach. So where you have existing architectures that you're going to be modifying to deliver new capabilities, and then at a certain point you can move into incorporating new ones, then that fits nicely with this particular approach. So trying to identify those solutions would be another activity that we'd want to play around with. And we want to be fully aware of what the risks are. At this point in the training, of course, there's been a heavy emphasis on why this is so good and why we're excited about it, but we want to be really aware of where the problem areas potentially are. So areas of risks for Agile architecture is how ready your organization is. A big part of any kind of new approach is making sure that people understand it and are prepared to work with it, which of course leads to things like, well, what are the skill level? Do they have an understanding of it? What kind of training would be needed to bring those skills up? Another part with doing an Agile architecture approach is understanding what the building blocks are. What should go into the building phase 1 and building phase 2 and building phase 3? So we need to have appropriate decomposition. We need to understand dependencies really well. So making sure that we know a good starting place, what to build first. And that comes with the ability to do that. So improper decomposition could derail an Agile architecture solution. Having requirements at any phase poorly articulated, where they're misunderstood, they're incomplete. So having a practice that actually ensures that requirement statements are well defined and translate well into being identified as an architecture requirement versus perhaps a functional requirement for the projects to implement. Another challenge we have if we're going to be more inclusive with our stakeholders is running into the issue of dealing with too many cooks in the kitchen. We want to be inclusive, but there still has to be a leader. There still has to be the decision maker. I like Star Trek, and so my analogy for this is we want to make sure that with our Agile architecture practice that we're actually using the Picard approach, thinking of the next generation. But how you have a leader that recognizes the expertise and leans on the expertise of those around, but then it has the final say, is making that decision. And then, of course, improper use of the approach, trying to do Agile architecture where it doesn't fit. So we want to go back to that previous slide where we're talking about where it's not the end-all be-all, but it does have a particular place where we can get good benefits out of it. So then that would have us conclude then, well, let's actually list off, let's end on a positive note and talk about the recommendations to ensure the success in doing this. And the first piece is definitely making sure that the knowledge and expertise is increased and that the appropriate people are being assigned into the roles that are going to take the lead on it. So success factors, in addition to working off of the skill set of the people, is knowing where this fits and then having good pilots chosen so that you can get the buy-in from the key players. So we can see this is a good place to start, this is when we're going to return results, this is the value we expect to see. You're communicating in a way that gets the buy-in, and then you can start to build momentum. The other thing, of course, is knowing what your goals are, how you're going to measure success brings you back to looking at, I've got to identify how I'm going to measure for them so that I can prove that I did it well. And if I didn't, how do I get it right next time? So it centers around being goal and product focused. So those are the recommendations for success, and in the training we would go through that in more detail, obviously. So that brings us into our offerings. We have the Introduction to Agile Architecture, and that would cover basics and the connection, a 2-day session. We also have coming up early December is Implementing Agile Architecture. That would cover the how-tos and the risks and reality and recommendations. The Comprehensive Agile Architecture would be covering in 4 days all of that, going from the introduction to implementing it. So 3 courses, 3 exciting courses coming up to actually just start getting involved in doing that Agile architecture. So Agile architecture is an innovation in architecture. Whether you're just starting with the better way to get architecture concerns addressed in Agile software projects, or whether you're going to take it to another level and say that what I've learned in doing that I can apply elsewhere in my architecture practice. That we do have comprehensive architecture training. The Introduction to Agile Architecture covers the basics and the connection between them. And then you have the Implementing Agile Architecture, so going over what's involved in building a practice and actually walking through that and how to do solutions with it, and then having a clear understanding of what the risks are and the recommendations to ensure success. We do have also, if you're interested in following up, we are taking registrations on the first of the courses, the Introduction to Agile. So you should see on your screen now the listing of the Introduction to Agile training. So you can go to the webagesolutions.com site and look for Introduction to Agile Architecture, or talk to your WebAge Solutions representative and they can walk you through this. But it is there now, ready to take registration, and then of course you can express interest in the other courses as well and be first to get on board with that. So thank you very much for attending. I did notice one comment there about downloading the PDFs. Your link should have allowed you to download the slide deck that I had there. If not, then go back to your WebAge representative and we can ensure that you get a copy of the slide deck that we presented here. So thank you very much for your participation, and I'll stay on the line for a few minutes here if anybody had any questions for me, but otherwise this session is done, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you successful in doing Agile architecture.